Good evening and welcome. My name is Viv Ellis and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Education here at Monash University. First, I would like to acknowledge the land on which I'm speaking to you today, over which sovereignty was never ceded. Today I'm speaking from the lands of the Yaluk Whelan clan of the Boonwurrung people, communities of the Kulin Nation. And as a faculty, we pay our respects to their elders, past, present and future through our teaching, our learning and our research. So, welcome to Life Disrupted, Young People, Education and Employment Before and After COVID-19. This is, I think, in the language of launches, a soft launch of our faculty's new research centre, CYPEP, the Centre for Youth Policy and Education Practice. CYPEP represents the single largest investment in research that our faculty is making from its operational budget, and it is doing so in recognition that education and education systems sit within broader sociocultural contexts within which there are opportunities both reproduction and transformation. The faculty's vision for the centre puts people first, young people or youth, in the midst of complex and continually changing relationships between formal education, training, and society, particularly the world of work. And by placing emphasis on education practice in its title, our hope is that the centre challenges education practitioners and education policymakers to engage critically with their own participation in these reproductive and transformative systems. This evening, you're going to hear from three researchers associated with the centre: its director, Professor Lucas Walsh, Dr. Joe Gleason, and Dr. Brady Robards. But before I introduce Lucas, can I encourage you to put your comments and questions into the YouTube chat? You need to be logged in to do that. And there were instructions, I think, in the registration email that you had. Do tweet if you use Twitter using the hashtags MonashCYPEP, Research in Action, or Youth Disadvantage. And don't forget to tag at Monash Education and at MonashCYPEP when you do that. Now, I'll be back at the end of the presentations that you're about to hear to offer a few comments before I hand over to the presenters for their Q&A. So now over to Professor Lucas Walsh, Director of the Centre for Youth Policy and Education Practice.
Many thanks, Viv. And I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So we're introducing you to some of the work of the centre tonight. And during the next 15 minutes, I'm going to provide you with an overview of the wonderful team that we've assembled for this centre, provide a little bit of an overview about the discussion paper itself and what kinds of directions the centre will move in over the next few months. I would also like to acknowledge my co-authors on the paper, Joe, Bert, Beatrice, but also to the team that supports the generation of this paper, to Marsha, Blake and Loren putting it together, to Stephen Roberts and Professor Dan Woodman for their incredibly helpful insights and feedback, and to Viv for his introduction. We've assembled this wider team together for the centre, and I'd like to introduce you to them tonight. We have three bodies informing our work, including a wonderful advisory board, and I would like to acknowledge them here tonight before I continue. Professor Amanda Barry, Catherine Ellis, CEO of YACVIC, Professor Alan France, who's based in New Zealand, Stephen Fraser from the Department of Education, Professor Michael Mintram from Monash University, and Katrina Raynan. I'd also like to acknowledge our management committee, including my colleague and friend, Associate Professor Mark Rickinson, Professor Paula Gerber from the Law Faculty, Asad from the Monash Business School, and Rebecca from the Faculty of Arts. Welcome to you all. And as importantly, if not more importantly, we'd like to acknowledge the Youth Reference Group that we've assembled to inform our work moving forward. For as Viv said, they are at the centre of what we do. So a big shout out to our inaugural Youth Reference Group, Yuki, Candice, Isabel, Stephen, Mark, Rebecca and Andrew. welcome to you all tonight. I've been thinking a lot, like many of you, about uncertainty over the last 18 months. Uncertainty is something that pervades contemporary life, but it has become more present in light of the pandemic. I'm interested in three kinds of uncertainty. The first is ordinary uncertainty, the type of uncertainty that we face on a daily basis. In my case, it's judging the traffic going to work, or the types of things that occur on a daily basis that we can't predict. There's also extraordinary uncertainty, the type of uncertainty that emerges when large-scale events impact upon our lives. This might be illness of a family member through to a pandemic. There's another kind that I draw from the works of Beck, of a kind of manufactured uncertainty, an uncertainty that circulates our social, economic, and political systems, and uncertainty that perhaps keeps people on edge and guessing what's going to come next. I'm going to come back to this manufactured uncertainty at the end of this presentation. But what I want you to do is to think about how these aspects of uncertainty swirl around your lives and, within the remit of the centre, around the lives of young people. A particular focus tonight is the ways in which COVID-19 has revealed deep fault lines in young people's relationship to work. From a youth researcher perspective, there's a lot about the effects of the pandemic that are in some ways unsurprising because they are rooted in deeper, longer-term trends that I'm going to outline shortly. A colleague of ours made a very salient point last year. He said, young Australians have been one of the groups to feel the full force of the pandemic, with thousands losing work and facing dwindling prospects in a battered economy and depleted labour market. These hold true today, even though some indicators, for example, of the economy are looking better than expected. We are indeed still in uncertain times. Our interest in the plight of young people is in the ways in which they can tell us about wider social conditions. And the plight of young people at present has connections back to the past. And they can also tell us about what might be emerging in the future. And these insights, we would argue, have wider applications to Australians in general and for many people throughout the world. So let's look to the past. We know that past economic downturns have hit young people immediately and disproportionately. We can look to things like the GFC of 2007 and 2008 to help understand the key economic and social effects on young people in this current pandemic. Young people felt the impact of the GFC immediately. As some have pointed out, they're often the first to go out the door when economic times turn tough, and they're sometimes the last to come back in. We know that they're affected disproportionately compared to many other areas of the population. But there are longer-term trends that we also need to understand. For example, I've just picked a few here. While the percentage of prime age workers has since increased following the GFC, the level of youth unemployment has not kept pace. Sorry, the level of youth employment has not kept pace. Prior to the pandemic, 1 in 3 young people were unemployed or underemployed. That is, part-time workers who are available to do more work. We see persistently that young people want to do more work, but can't. Youth underemployment has reached the highest levels in recent years in the 4 decades since the count officially began, as the Brotherhood of St. Lawrence has pointed out. Current trends are amplifications of things that were going on that predate the GFC. Since 1992, for example, the number of young people working full-time hours in casual employment has almost doubled. Australia has one of the highest shares of people employed in short-term, part-time work in the OECD. We see concentrations of young people working in the gig economy, which has grown by over 300% since 2016. More widely, we see young people in more of the types of casualised work, and in areas such as, for example, retail and hospitality. Those areas were affected immediately by the pandemic, as we have seen. Glimpsing briefly at the present, The job losses arising from the pandemic have been particularly severe in casual employment. Early in the pandemic, casual positions in small business fell by 25% versus 2% for full-time workers and 5% decreases in part-time jobs. Youth unemployment costs up to $15.9 billion per year, but we would argue that the real costs are considerably greater. And these are the kinds of things that are concerning and of central focus in our work at the centre. Sure, we're going to be looking and focusing on education and work tonight, for example, and in the discussion paper, but we're interested in wider indicators of wellbeing. We used as a focal point an episode from the ABC television show Q&A that was aired last year. Entitled Young and Free, it brought together different perspectives on young people early on in the pandemic. And to us, these perspectives provided windows onto attitudes towards young people at work, particularly during times of precarity. So we've got perspectives there from the point of youth representatives, from business, from the gig economy, but as importantly, a perspective from a young person named Natasha. Here's something that Natasha said. It's pretty distressing. You're told in school to follow what you want to do. This is what I want to do. I don't want to be a nurse. I don't want to be an engineer. I knew going into my media degree what career outcomes look like. There's obviously always going to be a need for healthcare workers, for all these emergency services people, but that doesn't change the fact that I've spent the last 3 years of university trying to do my best that I want to do for the rest of my life. I don't feel like I should be told to do a different degree because of the pandemic. There's no job opportunities for me. That's not fair. Her voice is one of many that we hear about having to respond to the needs of the economy. She was making reference then to the fact that there is a growth, for example, in healthcare, particularly for the ageing population, and that there'll be plenty of jobs there in the future. We see a similar discourse in relation to things like digital technology following the automation of labour. But she has had a dream and she wants to pursue that dream. And she's hearing voices saying, no, that's not possible. You've got to change your career plans. Natasha is reflective of a wider change in relation to careers, something that co-author Joe Gleason will talk about a bit more shortly from a career advisor perspective. In the report, we use that Q&A episode as a kind of a touchstone. We trace the challenges magnified by COVID-19 back to the reassembly and sometimes eradication of conventional occupational structures around the world on the back of post-war globalisation, post-Cold War globalisation, I should say. We look at the rise of factors such as automation and digitalisation of industrial production, which have accelerated this reformation. We look at things like 21st century skills, these so-called soft skills that have become so prevalent in the discourse about education. There is this drive for young people to acquire the skills to make them ready for contemporary work. There's nothing inherently wrong with developing these skills. Our challenge is when the discourse of these skills predominates and infuses thinking about work. At the same time, we see a disjuncture between conventional notions of careers and linear pathways to careers, to this reformation, the relationship between young people and their future work prospects. More deeply, young people encounter multiple and intersecting challenges involving various areas of disruption. And our concern is that these are largely constructed for them rather than by them. Current conditions encourage and foster this treading of water, this constant negotiation of curation of the self in order to be prepared for an uncertain workforce and uncertain future ahead. While we focus on young people, education and work, education does not exclusively exist to serve the economy, which we want to point out early on, that while this paper talks about work, we would be the first to say that there is much more to education than developing job readiness. Education is there to serve a wider set of purposes across personal, political, and social domains of life. Looking beyond the discussion paper to the future. We've got recent data around and snapshots just before the pandemic, and more recently in 2020, about the types of things that are concerning young people. And the Mission Australia Youth Survey is a very good place to start. It's found about 1 in 5 young Australians were highly concerned about financial security. The 2020 survey indicated that COVID-19 was the second and most frequently cited issue of national importance, and concerns raised in relation to the impact of COVID-19 and associated lockdowns, which included education, isolation, and mental health. Just incidentally, the top rated concern was equity and discrimination, increasing by more than 60% since 2019. Mental health obviously is a highly visible issue, and we've yet to fully understand the impact of the pandemic to date on young people's mental health. But we do know that just prior to the pandemic, 44% of 18 to 24-year-olds rated their mental health as average or poor. Other data suggests that young people in particular, aged 18 to 24, had the biggest proportion of high or very high levels of psychological distress of any age group. And we're starting to get indications that that figure has alarmingly increased. Elsewhere, we look at concerns about the future. 70% of Australians aged 18 to 44 say climate change is a critical threat versus 49% of those over the age of 45. Although, based on things like the recent release of the IPCC report, I suspect that that division between attitudes to climate change is shifting. In other research, we see the highest levels of prejudice continue to be directed against religious minorities, racial minorities, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, LGBTI people, and young people. Question for us is, what about young people at which the intersection of those prejudices take place? What's going on there? Anxiety about prejudice, climate change, and financial insecurity, and indeed insecurity in general, are by no means confined to young people. And this is one of the key propositions that the Centre is putting forward about how understanding challenges and opportunities facing young people have wider implications, reflect something wider in society. To that end, the Centre is currently working on the first annual National Youth Barometer. We're going to be releasing this later this year. It consists of a survey and interviews with young people about areas such as health and wellbeing, education and the labour market, money, housing, politics and the environment, technology, relationships, safety and risk. This survey attempts to measure the pressures faced by young people, hence the name Barometer. Understanding how young people are affected by these provides a kind of indicator or insight into wider society, measuring the pressures faced by young people, as well as potentially forecasting the weather ahead. This will be the main event in the formal launch of the Centre, as I said, that will take place later in the year. Our starting point is looking at the intersection of the kinds of challenges I've just raised, the intersection of social, economic, political, psychological, and other challenges faced by young people. We believe that education, youth voice, and policy are enablers of change. And as Viv has pointed out, they're also potentially reproduce certain structural problems and challenges. But we see a language of possibility in education and policy and a youth voice to be able to address some of the big challenges facing young people in our time. Our question is, how can educators and policy makers better respond to the types of challenges I've raised above? And how can we form surprising collaborations? And that's why we're looking to faculties across the university, and have indeed already started to work with them on these kinds of challenges, as well as via the exciting groups that I've mentioned earlier, our advisory group, our management committee, and our youth reference group. The starting proposition is this provocation. Is it possible to consider being young as a disadvantage? That is to say, young people experience certain things disproportionately and the intersection of events, and it renders it possible to start considering being young a disadvantage. So before I hand over to Jo, I'd like to take you back to where I started in thinking about how we respond to uncertainty. See, the spectre of uncertainty also looms large over the very purposes of education. We're thinking about dealing with everyday, ordinary uncertainty, as well as the uncertainty that comes from shock external events, like I said, illness, pandemics, and so forth, as well as this uncertainty that comes from the destabilization of our abilities to plan. Then what are we educating for? Are we educating for survival in an eternal present in which people are constantly expected to upskill without certain career trajectories, without a vocation, without their own senses of purpose? Are we educating to shape futures so that young people can influence and construct and create and shape their futures instead of those trajectories being shaped for them? And also, are we learning from the past? Because we do have a wealth of experience, as I've pointed out, to indicate the kinds of changes that we're seeing at the moment that have long tails going back to deeper economic and political trends. Our centre will explore these trends in relation to education policy and practice. Our belief is that the job of educators is not just about developing in individuals the skills to navigate uncertainty, but to work with students, to imagine and create conditions for a better, more secure life. We want to start a conversation about young people based on a language of possibility. And we're reaching out to our colleagues within the university and beyond to help us to do so. Life need not be one of perpetual disruption. Final word from Natasha. There used to be this very stepping stone way of getting to things. You build experience, you do internships, it builds networks and opportunities. That seems to be almost obsolete now. Right now, all we can think is, what are we going to do next? What is literally next? The spectre of uncertainty looms over these futures, disrupted and changed by geopolitical and economic developments the last 50 years. Now I'd like to turn to co-author and colleague Jo Gleason, who's going to provide a careers advisor perspective. I'll hand it over to you, Jo.
Thanks, Lucas. And thanks also to the new Youth Centre for including me in this inaugural event. As Lucas said, my name is Jo Gleason and I'm a research fellow here in the Faculty of Education at Monash, working on the CUBE project. But I'm also a qualified careers practitioner, and I've practiced as a careers advisor to young people transitioning from education into work for several years now, both within schools and in private practice. As a careers advisor, there were many things about the Q&A episode that struck me, most notably of which was Natasha's story. It was distressing at times listening to her about how trapped and even lost she felt, stuck somewhere in between her own career wants and dreams and the realities of future employment challenges. I was struck too by the fact that during the episode, she was the only one who questioned the careers advice that she had received whilst at school. Yet these questions went unanswered by the panel. Careers education and its relevance for young people was an absent topic during the entire Q&A episode. This absence or irrelevance brings sharply to mind the questions that Lucas just posed about the purposes of education in general. For careers education, particularly in schools, these questions are critical and must act to reshape approaches that appear woefully out of step for young people today. But what struck me the most about Natasha's story was she was female. And I've often wondered since first watching that episode, would she have told her story differently if she was male? Would she have had the same anxieties about her future? Would she have been so concerned, so distressed? And would I, as a female, have felt differently myself when listening to her story? We will obviously never know. But we do know that women face different challenges and concerns when they move from school into further study and from study into work. Despite an era of education and career opportunities that young women have supposedly never experienced before, they continue to be disadvantaged relative to their male counterparts. This is across a range of factors: pay, work hours, employment rates, and different industry work opportunities. Young women self-report higher levels of anxiety regarding future career prospects. They also worry about balancing different responsibilities, like having and raising a family, with their own work. As a careers advisor, the stories of young women I meet never fail to make me think. Think about what young women really can achieve, and actually whether they can have it all, and how tensions between their own aspirations and expectations and those of their families and communities shape and influence their career identity development and their goals for the future. Several years ago, when I was working at a disadvantaged secondary school in the outer suburbs of Melbourne, I met an incredible young woman, bright, ambitious, and she wanted to study medicine. She was incredibly anxious, though, about this choice, partly because of the status of medicine and her uncertainty about achieving this goal, but also because she did not want to let her parents down. They expected her to achieve success. Despite gaining the 8R and other exam requirements to enter medicine, including a scholarship for academic merit, she ended up turning down these opportunities because she could not study full-time. Why? She just couldn't resolve the conflict she felt over her parents' expectations of her career achievements, but also her obligations to share home duties and care for her younger siblings while her parents worked shifts. Her brother, 1 year older, and a carpentry apprentice, did not have the same home responsibilities and was not subjected to the same choices and decisions that his sister felt she had to make. I still keep in touch with this woman, and 6 years later, she has never gone to university. She could not face studying anything less than medicine, and believe me, she considered anything else as less, yet she couldn't see a way forward for her to balance her family commitments and obligations with study. Nor could she reconcile her own desires for a husband and children in the future with such a long study trajectory. This young woman's story is but one. And as a story like Natasha's, it raises important questions about the careers education and support that young women receive while at school to help them make sense of different career decisions. It also raises questions about how young women's careers and aspirations change and evolve as they move through study, training, work, and home duties. Do young women have the freedom to be as well as achieve what they want to be? To what extent can they plan the future, particularly in times of prolonged COVID-related restrictions? And how do these planning abilities impact their career identities, their senses of well-being? What careers advice and support are they getting in these early life stages to better prepare them for decisions in the future? Within the centre, these are questions that we're very interested in exploring. And as the plight of young people and what is meant by youth as disadvantage are examined through projects, as Lucas discussed, such as the annual National Youth Barometer, young women and their career identity development will be a nuanced but important aspect of this research. I'm looking forward to working with Lucas, the Centre, the Youth Advisory Group, and the broader education faculty and colleagues such as Brady in the arts faculty about addressing these important issues and questions. Thank you for your time tonight. And Brady, it's over to you.
Thanks so much, Jo. and thanks so much for having me as part of this. I also want to start off by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land that I'm streaming to you from today, the Wurundjeri people of Kulin Nations, and I'll join with the organisers in also paying my respects to Aboriginal elders, past and present, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us tonight. I acknowledge that I live and work on stolen land where sovereignty was never ceded, and that the effects of colonialism are ongoing and significant. So again, thanks so much for having me and inviting me to be part of this. I'm perhaps a little bit of an outsider, but I'm really excited to be joining you. I'm a research fellow in the School of Social Sciences in the Faculty of Arts here at Monash. And I suppose I'm representing a few of my colleagues tonight, and we're really excited to be have the opportunity, I suppose, to contribute to the centre and build some of those partnerships that Lucas and Joe have mentioned. So a bit about my background. I'm a sociologist of youth and digital culture, and I'm working on a few projects at the moment, including a DECRA project on social media and employment futures, which I think has lots of interesting connections to the discussion paper and the points that Lucas and Joe have outlined. But the project that I want to talk about tonight very briefly is a project that I've been leading with our colleagues Stephen Roberts and Ben Lyle and some other researchers who I'll mention in a moment, looking at young people's experiences of public services like Centrelink, Medicare, the ATO, skills and employment training, and many other public services offered by government. And I think that this is a really important point of connection, given many of the issues and concerns that, that Lucas and Joe have already mentioned here. And this project was actually in partnership with the Australian Public Service, and the work has gone on to be cited in the National Youth Policy Framework. So we're very hopeful that it will have a useful impact on some of these issues. Now let me just control these slides here for a second. So I want to talk a little bit about this project and some of our key findings as a way, I suppose, to connect to the research, the centre, but also to the discussion paper that Lucas and Joe have set out, because I think there are lots of great connections. So along with Ben and Steve from Social Sciences in Arts, I also want to acknowledge our other chief investigators across arts, Barbara Boposa-Neves, Zara Gazarian, Jonathan Smith, Jacqueline Lachlan-Boy, Verity Trott, and Joe Lindsay, plus a squad of amazing research assistants that have contributed to this project. As our funder liked to say, we really had a football team of researchers working on this project because it was a big project undertaken in a very small period of time. We ran focus groups with 155 young people in Australia during those early days of the pandemic last year, what feels like a lifetime ago now. And we conducted a national survey with 2,261 young people in just 6 months last year. So that was supplemented by secondary analysis of longitudinal quantitative data and also analysis of 30,000 social media posts. So we really pulled out all the stops to understand young people's experiences of these different public services at that particular point in time, early to mid last year. The big picture, though, in our research, and I think this connects with the work of the centre more broadly, is that this work is about improving the lives of young people in Australia. And public services might seem like a relatively, dry topic when it comes to the many different and exciting aspects of young people's lives, but it's kind of like where the rubber hits the road. And I think the support services that young people access and that are there to support them are really key, as Joe's talk mentioned and touched on very nicely. So I want to make a couple of points before I get into some of that data. And the first one is about the really complex and non-linear pathways that young people take into what we might think of as adulthood, whatever adulthood is. I'm still waiting to arrive, maybe one day I will. So what I mean by this is that even before COVID, and I'm going to talk about the impact of COVID shortly, but as the discussion paper that Lucas and Joe set out really clearly indicates, that young people, even before COVID, were navigating complex, non-linear pathways into adulthood. And we can think about these pathways in a variety of ways and look at things like education, employment, but also relationships and housing situation. These are some traditional markers of transition towards adulthood. There are, of course, many others. These are the 4 factors that we looked at in our analysis of some data from the LSA data, the longitudinal surveys of Australian youth. And this was some secondary analysis that Jonathan Smith conducted as part of our project that I mentioned before. And so in this analysis, Jonathan identified 6 pathways, common pathways, clusters of young people take towards adulthood. And you can see these on the slide here. There are 6. I'm going to focus just on the first 3 for brevity. What we can see here is that the biggest pathway, 24% of young people take, we call the single non-graduates. This is what we might traditionally call unskilled labour, but of course we know that many of these kinds of jobs require high levels of skill, valorised in a different kind of way. And of course, there's lots of vital skills that go into this kind of work. And young people who took this pathway by age 25 were not living with a partner. Many were still at home with parents and had a mix of stable and non-permanent work by the time they hit 25. So that was the most dominant pathway, with 24% of young people from this large longitudinal data set with almost 3,000 young Australians by 25. The next group was the secure graduates, the second pathway. And this is 21% of young people took this pathway. And this is what we might consider the traditionally sort of successful pathway in terms of higher education, job security, housing transition. But that's, of course, a fairly narrow lens on what success is. This was the group that was university educated with a mix of relationship experiences, but all of the people on this pathway were out of home by 25, which is, one of the traditional markers of transition around housing. The third group here, the 18% with non-graduates with stable employment. And this is the group who were partnered and living out of home. About 18% fell into this pathway. And then the smaller last 3 pathways included single precariously employed graduates, single graduates living out of home, and partnered graduates, many of whom were still living at home at 25. So I really rushed through these 6 pathways to try and make the point that the pathways young people take towards adulthood are very complex, non-linear, and also marked out by issues around precarity that Lucas and Joe have mentioned. And remarkably, I think that traditional sort of successful pathway, that second pathway, only 21% of the people in this data fall into that pathway. So that's, when we think about complexity and non-linearity, this is, I think, a great picture of that diversity of different pathways that young people take towards adulthood. So that was all before COVID. And then the point that Lucas and Joe and their colleagues make in the discussion paper is that the disruption caused by the pandemic have highlighted the prolonged disruptions to the daily lives of many young people. And certainly this is something that we found in our research as well. So as I mentioned, as part of this study, we conducted a national survey with more than 2,000 young people, and 18% reported experiencing a disruption to their studies. And remembering this was back midway through last year, so I suspect this has only intensified in the last year as the pandemic has gone on. And 57% said that their plans for future study had changed. A quarter had talked about their work hours being reduced. 12% were laid off or their employer went out of business. 6% were stood down without pay. 14% had their pay reduced. Really remarkably, and this is something that our colleague Barbara is working a lot on in terms of older Australians, but even amongst our young participants, more than half said they were more lonely as a result of lockdowns and restrictions related to the pandemic. Another point that Lucas has already touched on, but 40% of our respondents reported worse mental health outcomes during the pandemic, but about a similar number experienced sort of similar levels of mental health concerns. So it isn't to say that COVID has, changed everything for everyone, but there are some who have been significantly impacted. On a more positive note, a lot of our 17% also talked about increasing their social connections through digital media during this time. And this is an aspect of my research that I'm interested in pursuing more. And other researchers in Australia have been looking at the way that digital media can be leveraged as we are now to find pathways and to connect during lockdowns and during this pandemic. And some of the other research we're doing here is looking at young queer and gender diverse people and how their experiences have been quite different to their cis and straight peers when it comes to some of these sorts of factors. So just to kind of wrap up on, I want to touch very briefly on some of the qualitative findings. So as I said, we ran focus groups with 155 young people across Australia, 47 different focus groups, all through Zoom last year. And some of the key findings that came out in relation to our work on young people's experiences of public services was really around, first of all, the importance of those services for young Australians. And many of our participants were extremely keen to have their voices heard about how these services could be improved to improve their lives. So that was an important finding for us in reporting back to the public service. The second was about uneven experiences in terms of access to support. So there were varying levels of confidence in approaching and engaging public services based on gender, cultural background, language, and so on. There was also a big interest around how to destigmatize access to services. So we've all heard about, the narratives of the dole bludger, and young people were very keen on disrupting that. And we think this is a major obstacle to overcome in improving access to these services because they are important and they're an important right for citizens of this country as well. And then, of course, mental health was a big discussion point. Not just in terms of a sensitivity to mental health concerns in accessing services, but also in terms of the relationship between broader processes of individualization and responsibilization and how precarious employment situations impact on mental health and a sensitivity around that relationship in engaging with those services. So look, I'll end there, but I do just want to very briefly mention that this report will hopefully be made public very shortly. You can follow us on Twitter or email me directly to get access to it as soon as it comes out. It's currently waiting to be approved by a bureaucrat somewhere in the public service before it can be put online. And we also have a panel coming up in a couple of weeks as part of Social Sciences Week on September 6th on youth futures. And we hope that some of you will join us there as well when we're going to talk more about some of this research. I'll hand back over to Viv, but again, thanks so much for having me tonight.
Thank you very much, Brady, and thanks to all of our speakers, and thank you to also all the authors of the paper, including Bertel and Magyar and Beatriz Gallo Cordoba. I've had the privilege of reading the draft paper, and the paper will be available to everyone tomorrow, I think on the CYPET website. I also want to thank Professors Bob Lingard and Murray Brennan, who've helped us to shape this centre. Now, the issues that have been raised by the speakers have really chimed with me listening to them in thinking about our current experience of restructuring the Faculty of Education, which has moved from a single unit, basically one enormous department or school, to 3-school structure. And also thinking about how colleagues in the different schools might in the future contribute to the work of the centre. We're about to advertise a Level E professorial position in educational counselling, just the kind of work, the critical work that Joe was talking about in terms of careers or work advice. And in our new School of Education, Culture and Society, we'll be advertising for a professor at head of school, where one of the preferred specialisms will be education to work transitions. So these issues that have been raised by the speakers and in the paper are of interest and are of relevance to all of the schools within our new faculty. So, having read the paper, I'd like to make a few comments, raise a few questions before handing back to Lucas, who will chair the Q&A. And these comments and questions respond to some of them, the questions and the provocations in the paper. So my responses are intended to kind of respond to those you haven't seen, but also to be provocative. So I'm going to just go over 3. The first of which is around the category of youth or young people, category of youth or as young people. How much in common do people of the same or similar chronological age have? Now, the paper makes a pragmatic assumption that they do, and it puts a demarcated kind of age range around that. But the paper also raises a number of really interesting questions, like, do we expect young people to have jobs and work? How culturally specific is that kind of expectation? How specific is it to particular economies and education systems? Other concepts like debt. Are all young people sufficiently embedded in a financial system for debt to be a relevant concept? And if they are, what's the attitude to debt? Because it's one thing to take on a huge amount of debt in the expectation of future earning potential, or indeed parental capital. So there is something around an intersectional view of youth that I think is really worth pursuing in the future work of the centre, and just how much in common people have to refer to youth or young people using the same category. Now, there's a related question I have around career and career portfolio, and this is also interrogated in the paper. Historically, career has been regarded as something of a bourgeois concept, because if you have to work for a living, for goodness sake, you haven't got sufficient inherited wealth, and it's a lower class thing to do, isn't it, having a career? But it's become something in terms of an expectation or a future orientation to the way people are supposed to compose their lives. But the paper also raises important questions about work and questions the notion of a linear career. But the question that I have arising out of the paper and its comments on career portfolio and work is, does a job necessarily make one's experience of life precarious? So to go back to my first point about the category of youth and young people, do all people who have casual, very contingent jobs like being a barista in a cafe, especially during COVID, or in the gig economy, maybe an Uber driver, have the same experience of precarity? If you are a student on a business program at Monash University with the expectation of becoming an accountant, or if you're on our B.Ed course becoming a teacher and your parents are professors at Monash University or partners in Boston Consulting Group, then your experience of life is not necessarily as precarious as the person who is going to university for the first time in their family and working, or indeed thinking of being a barista or a Uber driver as a job. Third point I want to raise is disruption, and the point about life not being perpetually disruptive. And of course, you wouldn't want perpetual turmoil and turbulence. But I want to question the notion of disruption necessarily being a bad thing, and I think the authors of the paper do too. The context of the paper is during the COVID-19 pandemic. And one of the most interesting papers that has come out of that so far for me was by the French social scientist Bruno Latour. And Bruno Latour thought of COVID-19 as an opportunity in 2020, at least, to take advantage, as he said, of the enforced suspension of most activities. We've had to stop, to set out the inventory of those we'd like to see not coming back, and those, on the other hand, we would develop. So COVID-19 certainly presents disruption, and Latour's point was this disruption can be an opportunity for change. And certainly, I think where we are in 2021, you see the battle lines being drawn here. So I read the other day the New South Wales Productivity Commission's white paper, which was produced this year, and of about 7 or 8 recommendations, 2 are to do with teaching and education, and they are the most directly linked propositions between the quality of teaching and growth of GDP that I've ever seen. And these are really entrenched with quite carefully picked references to research. So COVID-19 has disrupted things, but I think one of the potentials of beginning the centre during the COVID-19 pandemic is that the hope that Lucas has talked about means that we can look on disruption as an opportunity for positive change, and to give some energy to that positive change, recognizing that where we are now, this is a fight, the battle lines are drawn, which is one of the reasons why I think the centre is such an interesting and exciting idea. So the paper will be available tomorrow. I encourage you to read it, and I will now hand back to Lucas, who will chair the Q&A.
Many thanks for those insights and provocations, Viv. And while we're giving our audience a chance to think and digest those, I would like to kick off by giving a brief kind of response, and then I'll throw open to Joe and Brady if you've got any additional comments. But I very quickly, just to go through those three things. Any youth researcher will tell you that youth and the definition of young people is an elastic concept. It's shaped by social factors, personal experience, and it is by no means homogenous to all groups. We put out the definition in the discussion paper, but we realise it's a somewhat arbitrary one because the experiences, for example, of being young are changing over time. And it depends on what kinds of lenses through which you're viewing young people and indeed adulthood that determine how you might attempt to categorise young people themselves. We have kinds of working definitions that are used by the United Nations and others that we'll attempt to draw on by way of comparability, but we fully acknowledge that young people as a category is fraught and sometimes nebulous. The second thing is the relationship to debt. It's very interesting that Viv's raised that because it's a preoccupation of our thinking within the centre, and it's built into the barometer, is to ask young people themselves about their relation to debt. And we're interested in particular in contemporary phenomena such as afterpay and this idea that you enter into incremental small amounts of debt very early on, while indeed from a macro level accruing huge amounts of debt. The huge amounts of debt are as yet unforeseen, but we can infer, or at least be concerned with, the amount of debt that has actually been injected by way of government interventions into the pandemic and the unprecedented amount of money that's been done to try to combat the pandemic. I'm not suggesting this is either right or wrong, but saying that the types of debt that are facing young people and their relationship to debt is changing, and it is in an unprecedented way. The other thing is, does doing certain kinds of work or jobs make one's life precarious? And there's just a few quick insights I'd point out there. Surveys of young people ask them, about how they feel about whether they want a career. And the majority will say, yes, they do want more than a job. But by the same token, there are many for whom a job is just one part of their life. It's a means to an end. And there isn't necessarily an attachment of that to some wider purpose or a bourgeois notion, to use Viv's terms. But we do acknowledge the fact that young people are seeking something more purposeful than necessarily just a job, although some do. Joe, Brady, I'll throw to Joe first. Any comments or thoughts about Viv's provocations?
No, I'll just pick up on your point there about that young people want more than a job. There's been some recent large-scale OECD research into the career aspirations or the occupational aspirations of young people across many countries. And it's fascinating that these notions of a career or notions of employment or an occupation, whatever word you want to put on it, they're very status oriented and they're very traditional as well. They're trapped somewhere, in a previous generation. But these careers represent success for these young kids, and we can't discount that. And it has to be factored into this whole notion of, as both you and Viv have talked about what represents precariousness, what represents employment versus a career, what represents success versus not. So that's really my perspective on that.
That's great. Thanks, Joe. Brady, any thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Lucas. I was just thinking about the debt point, and I think one thing that's worth acknowledging is that debt for people is very different for different people. So the idea of debt can be incredibly prohibitive to people for whom, their resources are limited. So for people from a lower socioeconomic background, the idea of going into debt for education, for a home loan, is incredibly prohibitive because that can seem overwhelming. Whereas for people from more privileged backgrounds whose parents, have resources, then debt might not be seen as a prohibitive factor, but might actually be a pathway to achieve their objectives. So I think, when we talk about debt, even when the amounts are similar, the effects are shaped entirely by class and socioeconomic position. So I think that that's a really important point to throw into the mix.
That's great, Brady. Yeah, a very, very, very salient point. Now, just to bookend and by way of segueing into potential questions from our audience out there, and welcome to you all. I'll start with a comment from Katrina, who said, I think that defining adulthood could be really important. I wonder about the intersection of youth and adulthood. Maybe both of these concepts are changing too. I would, and I'm seeing nods from Brady, and I'm sure Joe would too, that's absolutely correct. And we see those kinds of, those boundaries between being young and adult have always been blurry and problematic. And it's no more problematic than in the current period. Now, there are many, many dimensions to this, but, I'll give you two quick ones before I throw back out to the audience. One is that young people have for a long time got conflicting messages about what constitutes becoming an adult. And there's this very idea that you become something. The contradictory messages are manifest in very, very easy to determine ways. So, for example, I've heard directly from a young person who talks about the contradiction of being, say, 16 years old, employed in a job, paying taxes, and yet unable to vote in the elections that determine the conditions of those taxes. So there's a blurry line of work there where you're neither young or adult, you're somewhere in between. Also, we see actual messages sent from, let's call them adult institutions, about the value of young people's contributions to society. So, for example, when we see in the climate, the school strikes in regards to climate, we have seen from members of the community, including political representatives, the argument that they should, in fact, stay in school. But an argument emerging from young people throughout the world is, we're fighting for a future here, and what is the purpose of our education if our future is being annihilated? And that they have meaningful, important things to say, and they don't see any other opportunity, because they can't vote, to actually demonstrate their feelings and try to influence the worlds in which they live and inherit. Similarly, notions of adulthood have become stretched and elongated with time. So in previous decades, we've seen the notion of a kidult emerging. That is the kid that never quite makes the transition into adulthood. And we've seen these characterizations going back at least 1, 2, 3 generations. So the concepts of adult and young are very elastic and at times unhelpful. And it relates to what Joe was saying. If you're associating so-called youth transitions, which itself is a problematic term because it seems like you're going from A to B, but if we look at what Brady was talking about, there are these multiple pathways that are taking place, and the types of measures that we've used to characterize them, such as getting secure work, buying a house, or at least acquiring secure accommodation, or starting a family, have all been stretched and changing over time. And so these terms themselves are deeply problematic for us to work with because they're changing all the time. Another point I'd just like to raise quickly in relation to Viv's evocation of Latour is that indeed at the start of the pandemic, it wasn't an uncommon thought that we have time to hit the pause button to reflect on what's important and how we can rethink the ways that our society works. And from a personal perspective, the jury is still out on that because we're seeing pressures from various dimensions to go back to business as usual. And I'm concerned that we're not taking this moment, this opportunity to rethink how we live and what's important to us, which is partially why I drew attention to the purposes of education, because a lot of these wider questions around change that all of speakers tonight have been talking about come back to this. Well, what is the purpose then of our roles as educators and of the education systems and actors more broadly? Brady, Joe, is there anything you'd like to say on the back of what I just said? Brady, I'll go to you first.
No, look, I think that covers it all. I think the point about the question, from Katrina around defining adulthood and youth, it's really tricky. And as you said, there's been a long, history in the youth studies literature about this. For me personally, the older I get, the more extended out the definition of youth is. I just try and keep counting myself into the category of youth. That's my main objective. No, but I think, given what you said there, Lucas, I think you're right. There has been this, there's this non-linear thing, but there's also this sort of boomerang effect where, young people might make a transition towards adulthood, like moving out of home or finishing their studies. And then they might have to move back into home in order to do more study, or because their relationship ends and they need help looking after their kids or something. So I think there are these sort of reversible narratives now that we see. So it's not just sort of one direction. And so I think that needs to be considered in how we think about definitions. But this isn't new. But I think, as you say in your paper, COVID really amplifies and highlights a lot of these effects. And I just can't stop thinking about the last couple of years, someone who's just turned 16 or just turned 18 or just turned 21, and the kinds of rites of passage around, casual work and going out for the first time and, being in public spaces, like how all of these things have been impacted by COVID. And I think we'll be dealing with the effects of this for years and years to come, actually.
Totally agree. That's a great point, Brady. Joe?
Oh, I was just reflecting on this whole notion of getting back to normal, right? And the opportunity that COVID presents. But I don't think that we can underestimate how it's perceived as something fearful, right? That it is disruptive and it's not normal, and there's a need to get back to normal. When you were talking there, Lucas, it made me think about a student and their family that I was counselling only in the last fortnight, and the son or the student in this case was in year 12, and he was looking to follow an accounting pathway, and as his father rightly or proudly pointed out, he was going to be a third generation accountant in their family, and the fear that they had that this would not happen, that this would not just occur, was really real. And in fact, the mother at one point turned around and just said, I just want everything to go back to normal. And it was guaranteed that, my son would be an accountant. And I think this expectation of what is normal, what's not normal, what's disrupted, is a really interesting thing for the centre to explore as we're facing these questions of what's the purpose of education, what are the career trajectories or the job trajectories of young people.
Yes, very, very, very good point. And I mean, part of the paper looks at what this new normal might be, what it might look like. And thinking about what Brady and Joe have just said, and then linking it back to observations that Viv made, is that, disruption is not an entirely negative thing. It's not even a half negative thing. It can be a positive thing. And in fact, we see in youth researchers such as Honwana, this idea that this period can be a period of experimentation. It can be of trying new things. It can be of trying and not succeeding, and trying and making progress according to one's own definition of what that might be. So we don't necessarily need to think about disruption as an inherently bad thing. Really, I was framing it in relation to uncertainty, that might constrict, constrain, and unsettle one's plans. But there are those different dimensions. So, Chantel, we've got a few questions from our audience. I'll throw to you to raise them.
Okay, so the first question we've got here is employment the number one priority of education, or is it one of many objectives with belonging and connectedness as self-fulfilling and protective factors, perhaps of equal, if not greater importance?
Thanks, Grace. I've got a view about that, but Joe, what do you think?
Well, I think it's all encompassing. Myself personally, but I always find it fascinating to look at the different perspectives that people have regarding the purposes of education. But I think it's all encompassing.
I'm haunted by a quote before I throw to Brady of an American historian, Honeycutt, who made the wry observation that in the American context, at least, they used to teach for democracy and now they just teach for work. And we have to hold fast to the ideas that education serves a much more important and much richer and wider set of objectives. And when we're using the word education, we're using it in the broadest possible sense, that the places in which this meaningful education can take place are not confined to schools or universities or TAFEs, but they do in fact exist in informal, non-formal and formal settings. Brady.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. I think there is a real risk that increasingly, and we hear the government talk about, job readiness, and this has been a big shaping factor on the way that funding works in higher education in Australia, let alone what comes before, in secondary and primary school. And I think there is a real risk that we do go down this pathway. I think that education is as important, of course, links to employment and careers, but also personal careers. And in sociology, we talk about the personal career as something where you evolve a kind of set of views and ideas and perspectives on the world that goes beyond employment, but is much more, as Joe says, encompassing and holistic. And I think we really need to stand firm, especially in humanities and social sciences, but even beyond, on the productive aspects of education beyond a kind of employment career, in terms of thinking about a personal career and the development of individuals.
Well said. Well said. Grace, I think we have a couple of other questions before we start to wrap up.
Yes, we do, Lucas. We've got one specifically for Brady from Rebecca in our audience. And she's asking, did those who increase their social connections through digital media feel less lonely? And did they differ in their mental health?
Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you, Chantal, and thanks, Rebecca, for asking the question. It's not something that I've looked at specifically that I have to hand, but we are writing at the moment about this aspect in particular. So it's something that I can come back to you on with a more definitive answer. But certainly that question was asked in relation to those questions around loneliness. So the people that talked about leveraging digital media, and actually young, because I'm writing about this at the moment, the young queer and gender diverse people, our LGBTIQA plus respondents, talked about being able to leverage those technologies to a greater extent compared to their cis and straight peers. So that's quite interesting and not surprising for people that do research in this area, because young queer and gender diverse people use digital technologies to connect with like-minded people, with peers and communities in many different contexts. So it wasn't surprising, but it's quite an interesting point about who can leverage those technologies and who has the kind of skills and capacities to do that at a time like this. But in terms of its impact on experiences of loneliness, that's something that I'll have to come back to you on, but it's a great question. Thank you.
Thanks, Brady. So we've got time for 2 more questions, possibly 3. Grace or Chantel, you're mixing it up, so you get me guessing, which is what I like.
Okay, so our next question is to Joe. And as a career advisor, what single piece of advice would you give to young people to get ahead?
I think the best advice that I can give is to research, is to explore, is to talk to a number of people, and don't make assumptions about different careers. But look, there's a aspect of research in career education and career development that I love. And it's around having career conversations. And it's about encouraging parents, schools, broader communities, students with friends, students with mentors, to have career conversations. And they don't need to be particularly sophisticated, but they're about actually discussing, what do you do? How does that work? Where did you get to? Why did you make this decision? And I think that they're the most important things that I wish I could wave a magic wand and have every Year 12 student that was at this point in the year about to be putting in their preferences into tertiary admission centres, that they'd had at least one conversation with somebody outside their school, somebody outside their parent, to actually have their own opinion, form their own opinion, and not just follow what their parents expect of them or what their school leaders expect of them. That would be my best piece of advice.
Thanks, Jo. I mean, one thing I'd add to that, which is a well-worn drum that I bang, is that, and it comes from French philosophers, which is the notion that we think about a destination in life, the destination being adulthood, or the dream job, or secure work, or a debt-free life. We could have any of these indicators. But you and I in the audience both understand that the process of becoming, the journey to get towards what one imagines to be the destination, changes you. And it changes the nature of your relationship to that. Becoming itself is a productive process that shifts. And so when we're thinking about these targets that we put in, whether it be the ATAR or whether it be the particular job, that we have to be reassured in ourselves and assuring to others that the journey changes you, and just expect change, and that change can be a good thing. Okay, one last question.
Thanks, Lucas. We've got one last one. I think a few people are very keen to read that report that comes out tomorrow. But in the meantime, this last question will be from Katrina, who's asking whether young people see, or what young people see as the opportunity for change for the better. Has this been discussed with the youth reference group, and can you give any insights into that?
Well, the youth, sorry, just to repeat the question again, Chantal.
Sure. Katrina's wondering what young people see as the opportunity for change for the better, and has this been discussed with the youth reference group, and what are some of the insights coming from that group?
Beautiful. The audience might be reassured that the COVID fog descends at unexpected points. So anyway, I got the question the second time. We've just started discussions with the youth reference group. We've literally had one discussion to date, and part of what we're going to be looking at are what perspectives there are as to the future, and the types of things that they're hopeful for and potentially productively working towards. And of course, we've got massive, wonderful work being conducted by our colleagues around the country and around the world. But we've just started the journey. It's a great question, and we'll stay on it. All right. I think at that point, and particularly with the threat of the COVID fog descending upon me again at any random moment in the near future, I think I'd like to wrap it up. I'm encouraged that people are interested in the discussion paper. It'll be available tomorrow, as Viv has pointed out. These kinds of events do not happen without a wonderful support team and people working alongside us. First and foremost, I'd like to thank from my heart Brady and Jo for their wonderful words tonight, and for providing different perspectives on the kinds of things that are vexing us all. I'd also like to thank our Dean, Viv Ellis, for his kind introduction and thoughtful provocations, and to all of my colleagues from the centre who have been working very hard to bring some of these ideas to life, to convening and bringing together our wonderful advisory board, our management committee, and our youth reference group. And last but certainly not least, to the good people working behind the scenes to make this kind of event happen. These include Chantel, Grace, Luke, and Loren. I send my thanks out. And perhaps most importantly of all, thank you to you for taking the time, perhaps stepping out from the COVID fog for a minute to listen to our initial ideas and thoughts. The discussion paper is just a starting point. It's a kind of a calling card about some of the things we're thinking about, but we're heartened and challenged and excited by some of the questions and provocations that have come from you in the audience, from Viv and from our colleagues such as Brady. I'd like to thank you all and wish you a very, very good evening.